A white billionaire gets his black employee pregnant, so he fires her. 27 years later, his heart stops when he sees his black son while out with his wife. The soft chime of Vanessa's phone vibrated against her trembling hand as she stood outside the door of Elliot Crawford's office. The golden letters of his name glinted in the overhead lights, a stark reminder of the power and status he wielded. She took a deep breath, gathering the last bits of courage she could muster, and pushed the door open. Elliot barely glanced up from his desk as she stepped in. He looked as he always did. Sharp suit, immaculate desk, eyes focused on his work, as if she were an afterthought. Vanessa cleared her throat, but her voice still came out quieter than she'd planned. "Elliot, I need to talk to you." "Vanessa," he replied without lifting his gaze. "Can this wait? I'm in the middle of something important." "This is important too." Her voice had a tremor, but she pressed on. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Elliot finally looked up, his expression shifting from vague irritation to something colder, sharper. He placed his pen down, folding his hands on the desk as he examined her. "And what exactly does that have to do with me?" he asked, his tone clipped. Vanessa felt her heart drop. She'd known he could be dismissive, even harsh, but she hadn't expected this. "It's your child, Elliot," she said, barely holding back the quiver in her voice. "I thought you'd want to know." Elliot's face twisted, a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. "A child? With you?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I knew you'd pull something like this. You think you're the first woman who's tried to trap me with some scheme?" Her shock turned to anger, and she took a step forward, clenching her fists. "This isn't a scheme, Elliot. I thought you cared about me. About us." He scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down. "Us? There was never an us, Vanessa. There was me. And there was you. A distraction. A passing fling." His words cut into her like knives, but he didn't stop. "You really think I'd risk everything for a—" He hesitated, his face hardening. "A black child?" The words hung in the air, each one striking her like a physical blow. She felt her face grow hot, her fists trembling with barely restrained fury. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "How?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what something like this could do to my reputation? I've worked too hard to build this empire. I won't let some mistake ruin it." "A mistake?" she repeated, feeling the sting of tears but refusing to let them fall. "You call your own child a mistake?" Elliot leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if he were dealing with a nuisance. "Vanessa, you should have thought about all of this before you got yourself into this mess. You have two options. Either you get rid of it or you leave." Quietly. Her mouth went dry and she shook her head in disbelief. I thought you cared about me." "Care?" he repeated, laughing bitterly. "Listen to me, Vanessa. I care about my image, my business, my family, not you, and certainly not some child you're carrying. I'm not interested in playing house with you or anyone else, so take your sob story somewhere else." The words were harsh, each one colder than the last. She searched his face for some sign of remorse, some hint of the man she'd once thought she knew, but there was nothing, just a wall of indifference and pride. "What about the child?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. "What will you tell them one day?" Elliot's expression turned icy, and he pointed toward the door. "There won't be any one day, because after today, you're gone." The finality in his words left her frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make him see the cruelty of what he was doing, but she knew it was pointless. There was no humanity left in his gaze, no empathy or responsibility. Vanessa stood there, feeling her last shreds of hope crumble as security guards approached from behind. She didn't resist, as they gently took her arms and began leading her toward the exit. She glanced back one last time, hoping to catch a flicker of regret, but Elliot had already turned away, picking up his pen and resuming his work as if nothing had happened. The doors shut behind her with a final, deafening silence. Outside the office, she placed a hand over her stomach, a mix of sorrow and resolve settling over her. "Don't worry," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I'll protect you, I promise." And as she walked out of the office building, She carried both the pain of betrayal and a new purpose, a promise to herself that her child would never have to feel the hurt she had just experienced. 27 years later, Vanessa sat by her kitchen window, her gaze distant as she watched the early morning light spill across the quiet street. She had kept her secret buried for nearly 3 decades, choosing silence over reopening the wound that Elliot had left. For years, she had avoided anything that could bring that chapter back to life. No reminders, no lingering thoughts, no mention of him. But as she heard the chime of her phone and saw Malcolm's name light up the screen, a familiar unease stirred within her. She forced a smile as she answered. "Good morning, sweetheart. Mom, you're not going to believe it." Malcolm's voice was filled with excitement, almost breathless. She couldn't help but smile a little, hearing the joy in his voice. "Well, don't keep me waiting then. What's got you so happy?" "I got assigned as the lead attorney on a new case, a major one," he began, his voice swelling with pride. "Mom, this could be it. The case that gets my name out there, that makes people really notice me." "That's wonderful, Malcolm," she replied, but there was a nervous tremor in her voice. "Who's the client?" "Crawford Enterprises." He said the name with reverence, as if the very mention of it held weight. "You know, the huge conglomerate. This could open up everything I've been working toward." Vanessa felt her breath hitch, the warmth draining from her face. "Crawford," she repeated, almost to herself. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, a trace of concern slipping into his voice. She forced herself to speak, keeping her voice steady. "Malcolm, I think we need to talk about this, in person. Could you come over?" There was a slight pause. "Sure, of course," he said, uncertainty creeping into his tone. Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything's fine," she replied quickly, masking the tension in her voice. "Just come over, please." After hanging up, Vanessa sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on her. She had never imagined she'd have to tell him this, never thought that he'd get so close to the man who had turned his back on them. Malcolm arrived at her apartment soon after, his face still glowing with excitement, despite his worry over her strange reaction. As he stepped inside, Vanessa met him with a forced smile, gesturing for him to take a seat at the small kitchen table. Her heart pounded, her hands cold, but she steeled herself. She couldn't hide this any longer. "Mom, you had me worried," he began, his brow furrowing. "What's going on? You looked like you'd seen a ghost when I mentioned Crawford Enterprises." Vanessa took a shaky breath, folding her hands tightly on the table. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling to find the right words. "Malcolm," she started, her voice soft. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about your father." Malcolm's expression shifted, confusion flickering in his eyes. "My father?" he echoed. "Mom, you told me he was out of the picture." "I did," she said, nodding, "but there's more to it than that. You see, your father is—" Her voice caught, and she looked away, almost as if the truth itself were too bitter to speak. She swallowed, gathering her courage. "Your father is Elliot Crawford." Malcolm froze, the shock washing over him. He stared at her, as if hoping she'd correct herself, say she misspoke. "Elliot Crawford?" His voice was a whisper, his face etched with disbelief. "You're saying the man I'm supposed to represent, the CEO of Crawford Enterprises, is my father?" Vanessa looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "He's the man who left us, who didn't want us." Malcolm's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. All his life, he had wondered about the man who had disappeared, the one who had left his mother to raise him alone. He'd always assumed it was someone unremarkable, someone who'd simply vanished into obscurity. But this, a billionaire CEO, a man of power and influence, who had the means to help, yet chose to abandon them? "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally managed, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I didn't want you to carry that burden," Vanessa said, her own voice trembling. "Elliot made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us, especially not with a black child. He said it would ruin his image." Malcolm felt a surge of anger, the bitter truth cutting deep. "So he just left, without a second thought?" Vanessa nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "He didn't care, Malcolm. I begged him to at least acknowledge you, but he wouldn't listen. He fired me, told me to stay away, and I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I wanted you to grow up strong, without the weight of his rejection on your shoulders." Malcolm clenched his fists, his entire body tense with the rage simmering within him. So, all these years, he was out there, building his empire, while we were left to fend for ourselves, Vanessa finished, her voice heavy with pain. Yes, and he never looked back, never once reached out. Malcolm sat back, the reality settling over him like a dark cloud. The man he had admired from afar as a powerful corporate icon, the man he was eager to represent, was the same man who had turned his back on them, dismissing him as nothing more than an inconvenience. "Mom," he said quietly, a dangerous edge to his tone, "he's going to pay for this." Vanessa looked at him with worry in her eyes, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Malcolm, please, be careful. Elliot's not the kind of man who'll accept this quietly. He'll do anything to protect his reputation. Anything." Malcolm's eyes hardened, his jaw set with resolve. "He can try, but he's not going to silence me. Not anymore." Vanessa's hand tightened around his. "Just promise me. Promise you won't let this anger consume you." Malcolm met her gaze, nodding, though his mind was already racing with thoughts of confrontation. He'd spent his whole life building himself up, determined to prove himself, to become someone who mattered. Now, he had a chance to expose the man who had abandoned him. As he left her apartment, a storm of emotions churned within him. Anger, hurt, but above all, determination. This case was no longer just a career opportunity. It was a chance to confront his father and make him face the consequences of his actions. And nothing was going to stop him. Malcolm sat in his office, staring at the Crawford Enterprises file on his desk. The sleek corporate logo emblazoned on the cover was a reminder of the man behind it, his father, Elliot Crawford. Just hours ago, he had learned the truth that Elliot, the client he had been so eager to impress, was the same man who had abandoned him and his mother without a second thought. The urge to confront him was overwhelming, but Malcolm knew he had to be strategic. A heated confrontation in his office would do nothing but satisfy Elliot's arrogance. Instead, he decided he'd wait for an official introduction, an opportunity to look his father in the eye and let the truth simmer under the surface. He would go into the meeting as the poised professional lawyer, all while withholding his true identity like a hidden weapon. A few days later, Malcolm found himself standing in the opulent lobby of Crawford Enterprises. Everything around him screamed wealth and power, from the pristine marble floors to the towering windows overlooking the city skyline. The receptionist greeted him politely, and within minutes, he was led into a spacious conference room. He didn't have to wait long. The door swung open, and Elliot Crawford entered, flanked by his assistant and a junior executive. Elliot looked exactly as Malcolm remembered from countless magazine covers and television interviews, imposing with graying hair, sharp features, and an air of command. But now, seeing him up close, Malcolm couldn't help but notice the faint lines of age etched across his face, the cold glint in his eyes. "Mr. Turner," Elliot greeted, extending a hand with a carefully practiced smile. "Welcome aboard." Malcolm took his hand, shaking it firmly, his eyes locking onto Elliot's with a steady intensity. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. It's an honor to be here," he replied, his voice calm and polite, though his mind simmered with the knowledge of who this man truly was to him. Elliot studied him for a brief moment, his smile unwavering but assessing. "I've heard good things about you from the partners. They tell me you're one of the best young attorneys they've seen." Malcolm inclined his head, holding back the urge to respond with something more pointed. "I appreciate that. I plan to give this case my best." "Good," Elliot replied, his tone all business. "We expect nothing less here at Crawford Enterprises. I don't tolerate mediocrity." Malcolm could feel the condescension dripping from Elliot's words, each one a reminder of the man's arrogance. He chose his next words carefully, maintaining a polite tone. "I'm sure you don't. A man in your position has a lot to protect." Elliot's gaze narrowed slightly, as if sensing the underlying meaning in Malcolm's words. But before he could respond, the door opened again, and Helen Crawford, Elliot's wife, entered. She was an elegant woman, her posture straight and dignified, her gaze sharp. She approached her husband's side, giving him a soft smile before extending her hand to Malcolm. "Mr. Turner, I'm Helen Crawford. My husband has told me about your work. It's a pleasure to meet you." Malcolm shook her hand, nodding politely. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Crawford." Helen gave him a warm, practiced smile, but Malcolm could see the careful calculation in her eyes, the way she studied him with subtle interest. He wondered what she would think if she knew who he really was, if she knew that he was the product of an affair her husband had tried so hard to bury. "Elliot's a hard man to please," she said lightly, a glint of humor in her tone. "But if you're working with him, you must be very talented." "I certainly hope so," Malcolm replied smoothly, a slight edge to his tone. "I've worked hard to get here." Elliot cleared his throat, clearly uninterested in small talk. "Let's get to business, shall we?" For the next hour, they discussed the case, going over the various intricacies and strategies. Malcolm listened intently, taking in every word Elliot said, watching every subtle expression and movement. As Elliot spoke, Malcolm noticed the little tells, the slight shift in his tone when he talked about competition, the impatience in his voice when discussing lesser firms, the disdain for anyone who didn't fall in line. Toward the end of the meeting, Elliot leaned back, crossing his arms. "I expect results, Turner. We have a lot riding on this case, and I don't need distractions." Malcolm met his gaze steadily, a subtle intensity in his eyes. "Don't worry, Mr. Crawford. I'm not easily distracted." There was a beat of silence as the two men stared each other down, the tension in the air almost palpable. Malcolm could see a flicker of curiosity in Elliot's expression, as if he sensed that something was amiss. But before Elliot could question it, Malcolm spoke again, his tone perfectly controlled. "In fact," he continued, "I'd say I'm more motivated than ever to make sure this case is handled, personally." Elliot's gaze narrowed, but he dismissed the comment with a slight shrug. "Good. That's what I like to hear." As the meeting wrapped up, Helen stood and smiled at Malcolm, extending her hand again. "It was lovely meeting you, Mr. Turner. I look forward to hearing more about your progress." "Likewise, Mrs. Crawford," Malcolm replied, his voice polite but his mind racing. He watched her walk out of the room, a part of him wondering what kind of life she'd lived with a man like Elliot, if she'd ever seen past his charm and success to the cruelty that lay beneath. After the others had left, Malcolm was alone with Elliot for a brief moment. Elliot gave him a final curt nod. "Don't disappoint me, Turner," he said. "I don't have time for that." Malcolm held his gaze, his voice low and controlled. "Believe me, Mr. Crawford, disappointment is the last thing on my mind." Elliot gave him a strange look, a flicker of something like suspicion in his eyes, but he quickly brushed it aside. With a final dismissive nod, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Malcolm standing alone in the silence of the conference room. As the door closed behind him, Malcolm felt a surge of anger and satisfaction. He'd looked the man who abandoned him in the eye, had spoken to him as an equal, while Elliot remained oblivious. It was only the beginning, but he was ready to move forward, each step bringing him closer to the truth and to the reckoning his father so richly deserved. Malcolm gathered his things and walked out of the building, his mind racing with thoughts of his next move. He knew that today had only been a glimpse, a small step toward the full confrontation that was to come, and he was ready. Malcolm sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The upscale neighborhood around Elliot Crawford's estate was quiet, the kind of silence that came with wealth and privilege. His mind was a storm of thoughts, replaying everything he'd learned about his father, the man who had thrown his mother out without remorse, who had called him a mistake, a stain, the man who now lived a life of power and prestige, while Malcolm and his mother had struggled for every scrap of success. "Confront him," one part of his mind demanded. "Make him answer for what he's done." But another voice, quieter yet persistent, whispered back, "What if he destroys you?" Malcolm's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a message from his mother. "Remember what's at stake, Malcolm. Don't let him ruin everything you've worked for." He let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. She wasn't wrong. Elliot had power, enough to crush his career if he wanted to. But the thought of letting this man continue his life unchallenged, untouched by the pain he'd caused, was unbearable. Malcolm checked his watch. He'd done his research. This was the time of evening when Elliot and his wife took their nightly walks. He had thought about waiting, about weighing his options further, but no, this moment wouldn't come again. It's time. The air was cool as Malcolm walked down the dimly lit path outside Elliot's estate. The soft glow of streetlights illuminated the manicured trees lining the sidewalk. Ahead, he saw them. Elliot and his wife, Helen, walking side by side. Helen's laughter floated toward him, light and carefree, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Malcolm's chest. "Mr. Crawford," Malcolm called out, his voice sharp and cutting through the stillness. Elliot stopped mid-step, turning slowly. His face was a mask of mild irritation, his brows knitting together as he recognized Malcolm. Helen turned too, her expression curious but polite. "Mr. Turner?" Elliot said, his tone laced with confusion and annoyance. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm stepped closer, his jaw tight. "I need to talk to you. Privately." Elliot sighed, glancing at Helen. "Whatever this is, it can wait until business hours. You're overstepping." "No," Malcolm said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "It can't wait." Helen rested a hand on Elliot's arm, her curiosity giving way to concern. "Elliot, maybe you should hear him out." Elliot's irritation deepened, but he gestured for Malcolm to speak. "Fine," he said curtly. "You have 2 minutes. Make it quick." Malcolm stared at him, his heart pounding. But his voice was steady as he said, "I know who you are, and I don't mean the CEO of Crawford Enterprises." Elliot's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm your son," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the night. "The son you abandoned, the one you didn't want, because he was black." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to Elliot. "Elliot, what is he saying?" Elliot's expression froze for a moment, then hardened into cold denial. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're lying." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice rising with anger. "Don't you dare stand there and deny it. You threw my mother out of your office like she was trash. You called me a mistake, a stain on your perfect image. And now you're going to pretend it didn't happen?" Helen turned to Elliot, her voice trembling. "Elliot, answer him. Is this true? Did you have an affair?" Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is none of your concern, Helen." "None of my concern?" she yelled, her voice rising. "Your son just confronted you, and you think this isn't my concern?" Elliot turned back to Malcolm, his voice low and menacing. "I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, Turner, but you're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not playing anything," Malcolm shot back, his voice sharp. "I'm here to tell the truth you've been running from for 27 years. Elliot's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping further. "Listen to me, boy. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I could destroy you, your career, your reputation, everything you've worked for. It would take one phone call." Malcolm didn't flinch. "Go ahead and try, but the truth is already out. You can't threaten it away. You can't buy your way out of this one." Helen's voice broke through, sharp and furious. "Elliot, stop this. Is he telling the truth? Did you abandon him? Did you—" "Enough, Helen," Elliot barked, turning on her. "This is a private matter." "No, it's not," she snapped, her voice shaking with rage. "You lied to me. You lied to everyone. How dare you?" Malcolm stepped forward, his voice cold and deliberate. "For years you've hidden behind your money and power, pretending to be this untouchable, perfect man. But you're not. You're a coward, a man who threw away his own child because he couldn't be bothered to deal with the consequences." Elliot's face twisted with anger, and he jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. "You don't know a damn thing about me. Don't stand here and lecture me like you're some moral authority. You're nothing." Malcolm leaned in, his voice steady and filled with fury. "I'm more than you'll ever be, and the world's going to know exactly who you are. A liar, a coward, and a man who abandons his family." Elliot took a step closer, his voice a venomous growl. "You think you're untouchable? You think I won't come after you for this? I know you will," Malcolm replied, his voice calm but seething. but I'm not afraid of you, and you can't intimidate me into silence." The silence that followed was thick and charged. Helen looked between them, her face pale and her voice trembling with fury. "I can't believe this. All these years, Elliot. All these lies." Elliot turned to her, his voice sharp. "Don't you start. This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she shouted. "You cheated on me. You had a child and abandoned him. You humiliated me, and you don't even have the decency to admit it." Malcolm stepped back, his chest heaving as he stared at the man who had cast such a long shadow over his life. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "You're damn right it's not over," Elliot hissed. "If you think you can walk away from this unscathed, you're even more foolish than I thought." Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "Do your worst, but you'll never silence the truth." As he turned and walked away, Helen's furious voice echoed behind him, her words cutting into Elliot as she unleashed years of pent-up anger. Malcolm didn't look back. For the first time, he felt the balance of power shift. This was only the beginning, and he was ready for what came next. Malcolm sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. His office, usually a place of focus and order, felt stifling. Papers and legal briefs were scattered around him, but his attention was elsewhere. The confrontation with Elliot lingered in his mind, replaying every heated word and threat. The rage in Elliot's eyes, the venom in his voice. It had been a battle of wills, but Malcolm had stood firm. Now, it was time to take the next step. He stared at the notes he'd begun compiling, a growing dossier of Elliot's past misdeeds. It wasn't just about the personal betrayal anymore. The man had built an empire on arrogance, cruelty, and exploitation. There had to be more skeletons in Elliot's closet, ones that could destroy the facade he so carefully maintained. But Malcolm couldn't do this alone. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him from his thoughts. A text from his mother. "Are you okay? I'm worried about you." He sighed, typing a quick reply. "I'm fine, Mom. Don't worry. I'm being careful." He wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Taking on Elliot Crawford wasn't just risky. It was a move that could cost him everything. But he couldn't back down now. Later that evening, Malcolm sat across from a trusted investigator he had worked with on previous cases. The man, a seasoned professional named David, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on Malcolm. "So, let me get this straight," David said, his tone skeptical. "You want me to dig into Elliot Crawford, a man with the resources to make people disappear if he wanted to?" Malcolm nodded. "That's exactly what I want." David let out a low whistle. "You're either brave or crazy, maybe both." "I'm determined," Malcolm replied. "There's a pattern with men like him. They leave trails. They just think no one's smart or brave enough to follow them." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You've got more than a personal stake in this, don't you? This isn't just about calling him out as your father. It's bigger than that," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "He's gotten away with too much for too long. If I can expose him, maybe I can stop him from hurting anyone else." David studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up. But you'd better be ready for pushback. Men like Crawford don't roll over easily." "I'm counting on it," Malcolm replied. Over the next few days, Malcolm worked tirelessly, juggling his legal responsibilities while quietly building his case against Elliot. He reached out to former employees of Crawford Enterprises, carefully wording his inquiries to avoid raising suspicion. Through whispered conversations and subtle prodding, he began to uncover a pattern. NDAs signed under duress, employees bullied into silence, and deals that bordered on, or crossed into, illegal territory. Each revelation added fuel to the fire. The man who had dismissed him as insignificant had left a trail of destruction in his wake, and Malcolm was determined to bring it all to light. One evening, Malcolm received a call from David. His voice was low but urgent. "You were right," David said. "There's a lot more to Crawford than meets the eye. Financial irregularities, suppressed lawsuits, even whispers about bribing officials to cover things up." Malcolm felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by caution. "How solid is the evidence?" "Solid enough to make him sweat," David replied. But it's going to take more than a few whispers to bring him down. You need something undeniable. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What about my mother? If she's willing to speak out, her story could add weight to everything. David hesitated. That's risky. He's going to come after her if you put her in the spotlight. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I'll protect her. I'll protect anyone he tries to hurt. David sighed. All right, I'll keep digging. But you need to be ready for whatever comes next. I am, Malcolm said, his voice steady. This ends with him facing the consequences. That night, as Malcolm sat alone in his apartment, he opened his laptop and began drafting his strategy. It wasn't just about the law. It was about telling a story that would resonate with people, that would expose Elliot for who he truly was. He wasn't naive. He knew Elliot would fight back with everything he had. But Malcolm had spent his life fighting too. As he stared at the glowing screen, the weight of the task ahead pressed down on him. But beneath it, there was a fire, a determination that no threat or power could extinguish. Elliot Crawford had spent decades silencing those who opposed him. But Malcolm wasn't going to be silenced. Not this time. The battle was just beginning. Malcolm walked into his apartment late in the evening, his shoulders heavy from the long day of planning. His case against Elliot was taking shape. His investigator had unearthed enough questionable dealings to weaken Elliot's defenses. Combined with his mother's story, Malcolm knew he was starting to build a case that could truly shake the foundation of Crawford Enterprises. But he also knew what came next: retaliation. Elliot wasn't the type to sit back and let someone challenge him without striking back. Malcolm had braced himself for it, but the first blow came sooner than expected. As he set his keys on the counter, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Frowning, he answered. Mr. Turner, a voice said, smooth and vaguely threatening. You've been very busy, haven't you? Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? The voice chuckled softly. Someone who represents the interests of Mr. Crawford. And I'm calling to give you some friendly advice. Drop whatever you're working on. Walk away. This doesn't have to go any further. Malcolm's jaw clenched, but his voice was calm. If Elliot has something to say to me, he can do it himself. Oh, trust me. This isn't just Elliot's concern anymore. The voice replied. You're poking a very dangerous bear, Mr. Turner. We wouldn't want your promising career or your mother's business to suffer because of a misunderstanding. The thinly veiled threat ignited a fire in Malcolm's chest. Is that supposed to scare me? It's a reality check, the voice said. You're playing a game you can't win. Walk away while you still can. The call ended abruptly, leaving Malcolm staring at the phone. His blood boiled. The attack wasn't just personal. It was calculated, a reminder of the power Elliot wielded. But instead of deterring him, it only fueled his resolve. The next morning, Malcolm met with his investigator David in a quiet cafe. The tension in Malcolm's voice was evident as he recounted the call. They're trying to intimidate me, Malcolm said, leaning forward, and they're not just coming after me. They're targeting my mother. David frowned, his face serious. I warned you this would happen. Guys like Elliot don't fight fair. They don't have to. Malcolm's hands balled into fists. We need to hit harder. Keep digging. I don't care how deep you have to go. There has to be something that will bring him down. David shook his head. I'll do my part, but you need to be smart about this. If they're making threats, it means you're onto something that scares them. That's good, but it's also dangerous. They'll come after you with everything they've got. Let them, Malcolm said coldly. I'm not backing down. That evening, Malcolm arrived home to find a black car idling across the street. The windows were tinted, the driver invisible. Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he walked up the steps to his building, glancing back briefly before stepping inside. Minutes later, there was a knock at his door. He opened it cautiously, finding Elliot Crawford himself standing there, impeccably dressed, but with a storm in his eyes. May I come in? Elliot asked, though it was less a question and more a command. Malcolm didn't move, blocking the doorway. You have something to say. Say it here. Elliot's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. Fine. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. Whatever stunt you think you're pulling, end it now. Malcolm's expression hardened. Or what? You'll destroy me? Ruin my career? Call your lackeys to make more threats? Elliot's lips curled into a cold smile. You're smarter than I thought. Yes, that's exactly what I'll do. And trust me, I'll succeed. Malcolm crossed his arms, his voice steady. Go ahead, try. But we both know you're panicking. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Elliot's composure slipped for a moment, his mask of control cracking. You don't know what you're up against, Turner. I've crushed people 10 times stronger than you. I've built this empire from nothing, and I won't let some disgruntled bastard tear it down. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice sharp. You built that empire by stepping on people like my mother. You think your money and power make you untouchable? But they won't protect you forever. The truth is coming out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Elliot's eyes blazed with fury, and he pointed a finger at Malcolm. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will ruin you. Your career, your reputation, everything you've worked for will be ashes. Malcolm didn't flinch. Do it. Destroy me if you want, but I'll still have the truth. And when people hear it, your empire will crumble. The two men stared each other down, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Elliot stepped back, his voice low and venomous. You're making a mistake you won't recover from. No, Malcolm replied, his voice calm but resolute. The mistake was yours, 27 years ago, and now it's finally catching up to you. Elliot turned and stormed off, slamming the door behind him. Malcolm stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. He knew this was only the beginning of the fight, but he wasn't backing down. If Elliot wanted war, he was going to get one, and Malcolm was ready. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the seats packed with onlookers, journalists, and legal professionals drawn to the high-stakes showdown between Malcolm Turner and Elliot Crawford. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table, his face composed, though his heart beat rapidly. Across from him sat his father, the man he was about to expose. Malcolm's mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead. He was here to reveal the truth, not just for himself and his mother, but for everyone Elliot had crushed in his ruthless ascent to power. The judge entered, and the room quieted, a heavy silence settling over the crowd. Malcolm's mother, Vanessa, sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She met his gaze, and he gave her a reassuring nod, feeling the weight of what this meant to her. Today, they would finally be heard. The first witnesses took the stand, one after another, former employees of Crawford Enterprises who had endured years of mistreatment, many of them forced to sign NDAs to silence their stories. Malcolm's questions were precise, each one revealing another layer of Elliot's calculated cruelty. A former assistant recounted how she'd been threatened into keeping Elliot's affairs and secrets hidden. I was young and scared, she admitted, her voice trembling. They told me that if I ever spoke out, my career would be over. Elliot's lawyers sprang up, attempting to discredit her, painting her as disgruntled and bitter. But Malcolm was prepared. With each witness, he cut through the defense's arguments, bringing out testimony that highlighted a pattern. Elliot's willingness to silence, intimidate, and control anyone he deemed an obstacle. Piece by piece, Malcolm built a case that struck at the heart of Crawford Enterprises. Each testimony added weight to his narrative, that this empire had been built on deception, exploitation, and abuse. The more Malcolm revealed, the more tension filled the courtroom, and he could see the strain on Elliot's face as he fought to maintain his cold, stoic demeanor. Finally, the time came for Vanessa to take the stand. Malcolm's mother approached the witness box, her steps slow but deliberate. She glanced at him briefly, drawing strength from his presence. Malcolm rose and approached her, his voice gentle. Mrs. Turner, he began, meeting her eyes, can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Crawford? She took a steadying breath. I was Elliot's personal assistant for 3 years. I worked hard for him, trusted him. Her voice wavered slightly, but when I told him I was pregnant with his child, everything changed. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. What happened when you told him? Malcolm asked, keeping his voice steady. Vanessa swallowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the witness box. He called me a liar, accused me of trying to trap him. And then he told me he didn't want a black child ruining his image. He fired me on the spot and had me escorted out like I was nothing. A murmur rippled through the audience. Elliot shifted in his seat, his expression hardening as his lawyers leaned in, whispering strategies to counter the testimony. Malcolm stepped forward. Did Mr. Crawford offer any support for you or your child after that? No, she said, her voice now filled with strength. He made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us. He erased us from his life. Elliot's defense lawyer rose, his tone sharp as he cross-examined her. Mrs. Turner, isn't it true that you signed a severance agreement with Mr. Crawford's company upon leaving? An agreement that included a confidentiality clause? Vanessa's gaze was unwavering. Yes, but it wasn't a choice. I needed that money to support my son. That agreement wasn't a gift. It was hush money. The lawyer smirked. Yet, you took it. So you were compensated, weren't you? Vanessa's eyes narrowed. I was silenced. That's not compensation. That's coercion. Malcolm felt a swell of pride as she held her ground, her strength undeniable. He returned to his seat, his mind focused on the next step. They still needed something more, something concrete to break through the defense's attempts to muddy the truth. As the case progressed, Malcolm presented the financial documents and records that his investigator, David, had uncovered. Irregularities in corporate spending, falsified accounts, and payments made to keep certain issues under wraps. The evidence painted a damning picture of Crawford Enterprises, and each new revelation chipped away at Elliot's carefully curated image. Finally, it was Elliot's turn to take the stand. He looked every bit the composed CEO, his demeanor controlled as his lawyers guided him through rehearsed statements. They attempted to frame him as a successful businessman, targeted by a bitter ex-employee and her son, a man on a vendetta. Malcolm approached, his voice cold and precise as he began his cross-examination. Mr. Crawford, you portray yourself as a man of integrity, but the records show payments to silence former employees and avoid lawsuit. Can you explain that? Elliot's jaw tightened. Those were standard business decisions. We handled disputes internally to avoid unnecessary publicity. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice firm. And what about my mother? Was firing her and abandoning your own child a standard business decision as well? Elliot shot him a glare, his composure slipping. This isn't about personal matters, Turner. It's about a smear campaign orchestrated by someone looking for a quick payday. Is that what you think of me? Malcolm's voice was steady, though his heart pounded. Someone who wants a payday? Or maybe you see me the same way you saw my mother, as someone you can simply discard. The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Malcolm didn't back down, his questions relentless, exposing the hypocrisy in every one of Elliot's answers. The mask of control on Elliot's face began to crack, his voice growing sharper, defensive. When the judge called a recess, Elliot's glare was fixed on Malcolm, a barely restrained fury in his eyes. But Malcolm had done what he came to do. He had shown the court who Elliot Crawford truly was. The final day of the trial arrived, and the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. As the judge delivered his ruling, the weight of the verdict was unmistakable. Malcolm had won. Elliot's empire had been shaken, his reputation permanently tarnished by the truth that Malcolm and his mother had fought so hard to bring to light. Elliot sat in stunned silence as the reality of his defeat sank in. Around him, the courtroom erupted with murmurs, journalists scribbling furiously as they captured the fallout of a man who had spent decades hiding behind wealth and power. Malcolm turned to Vanessa, who looked at him with a mix of pride and relief, her eyes glistening. He took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. For them, this was more than a legal victory. It was justice. It was finally breaking free of a shadow that had loomed over them for years. As they exited the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing, questions shouted in a chaotic blur. Malcolm held his head high, shielding his mother from the frenzy. They had done it. The truth was out, and Elliot Crawford, the man who had threatened to destroy them, was now the one left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was free from Elliot's control, from the legacy of betrayal and abandonment. He had found justice not just for himself, but for his mother, and for everyone Elliot had hurt along the way. Days after the trial, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines splashed across every major newspaper, and reports filled the airwaves. Elliot Crawford, once a giant in the business world, had been brought down by his own son, a son he had refused to acknowledge, whom he had tried to silence. The scandal reached every corner of the corporate world, and the public reaction was brutal. Crawford Enterprises' stocks plummeted, and shareholders demanded his resignation. Former allies distanced themselves, and prominent figures withdrew their support. For the first time in his life, Elliot Crawford was facing consequences he couldn't buy or intimidate his way out of. Malcolm and his mother, Vanessa, sat together in her living room, the quiet filling the space between them. They had spent years carrying the weight of Elliot's rejection, enduring in silence. But now there was a new calm, a relief that came from knowing the truth was finally out. Vanessa placed her hand on Malcolm's arm, her voice soft. "You did it, Malcolm. You fought for us." Malcolm looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I did it for you, Mom. For all those years you carried this alone. I couldn't let him get away with it." She gave him a gentle smile, the years of pain softened by gratitude. "I'm so proud of you. You've done more than I ever could have imagined." They sat in reflective silence, the echoes of their victory settling in. Malcolm knew he'd always carry a piece of this fight within him, the scars of his father's abandonment, the anger of years spent in his shadow. But he also felt something else, a quiet strength. For the first time, he felt he could truly move forward. A few days later, Malcolm found himself outside his office, where a swarm of journalists still hovered, eager for his response to the verdict. As he made his way to his car, a reporter stepped forward, her microphone extended. "Mr. Turner, now that the truth is out, how do you feel? What do you hope people will take away from this?" Malcolm paused, considering her question. He glanced back at the office building, a symbol of everything he'd worked for, his own hard-won success, untouched by his father's influence. "I hope people see that no one is above accountability," he said, his voice steady but firm. "My father may have built an empire, but he did it at the expense of others. And sometimes, no matter how powerful you think you are, the truth finds a way." The reporter nodded, scribbling down his words as others pressed closer. But Malcolm didn't wait. He gave a polite nod and moved through the crowd, feeling lighter with each step. That evening, Malcolm drove to the neighborhood where he had spent his childhood. The streets were familiar, each one filled with memories of simpler times before he'd known the truth of his father's identity. He parked outside the small, unassuming home his mother had worked so hard to keep, the home where he'd learned resilience, where he had found his first dreams of success. Inside, he walked through the quiet house, memories flooding back with each step. He stopped by an old photo on the wall, a younger version of himself with his mother, their arms wrapped around each other, grins on their faces. The photo was worn, but the image was clear. They had always been a team. Vanessa joined him, glancing at the photo. "We made it, didn't we?" she whispered, a mixture of pride and nostalgia in her voice. Malcolm nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "We did, and we did it without him." Vanessa sighed, a bittersweet smile on her face. He thought he was so powerful, but he had no idea what real strength was. "Not like we do." They sat together on the couch, reflecting in quiet relief. It was a victory for both of them, but it was more than that. It was the closing of a chapter filled with struggle and heartache, but also one that had forged a bond between them that nothing could break. A few weeks later, Malcolm received a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the address traced back to an anonymous source, but the words were clear. "You've ruined everything," it read, signed with a single scrawled initial. "This isn't over." He set the letter down, a strange calm settling over him. It was undoubtedly from Elliot, a desperate attempt to rattle him, but it didn't. Malcolm knew who he was now, and no words from his father, no threats or scorn, could shake that. As he looked out the window, a sense of closure washed over him. He had confronted his father, brought his wrongdoings to light, and liberated himself and his mother from years of unspoken pain. Elliot might never change, but that no longer mattered. Malcolm had his truth, his peace. In the weeks that followed, he continued his work, now with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. His reputation soared, not as a lawyer known for his powerful father, but as one known for his integrity and courage. His career thrived, built on a foundation of his own making. In the end, Malcolm knew that justice wasn't just about winning a trial, it was about knowing the truth, living free of secrets, and finding strength in honesty and resilience. He had lost a father, but he had gained something far more valuable, a life untethered from lies, a future unburdened by the